I remember as a child, we would go at Christmas to see my grandparents, and I would witness, we were coming from England, the most reserved country on earth. We were going to Jamaica, one of the more extroverted countries on earth. And I remember as a kid, I would just be so perplexed. I would see my uncle, at the gas station, shouting at someone who worked at the gas station. And it would turn out later they were friends. I was like, you just were yelling at them. What is going on? I was little, totally perplexed 6-year-old, kind of funny. Why are you yelling at this person who's your friend? It's like, no, it's just Jamaica. It's
exactly, a love of the hyperbolic.
In a word, Malcolm Gladwell is
a very quiet mystery, which I would like to unravel.
He's the kind of person you can just have a conversation for 3 or 4 hours.
If you've never read a Malcolm Gladwell book,
read one stat, just pick one up, please, any one. They are all good.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Malcolm.
As you know, BookTube is a vibrant community of people who come to YouTube to share their love of books, learning, reading, and I think we're all delighted to be welcoming you today to this IRL BookTube book club to discuss your latest book, Talking to Strangers. So my first question is, why this book? Why now?
This book began with my reaction to the Sandra Bland case, which is the case that begins and ends the book. So it's the young black woman in Texas gets pulled over by a police officer. They get into an argument.
Get out of the car!
and then you're
I
gonna
will
stun
light
me?
you up. Get out!
And then she gets arrested and she commits suicide 3 days later in the cell. It's just this incredibly heartbreaking story. And it struck me, I was, like many people, very moved and distressed by that case. But I also realized that it was part of a much larger pattern in our society at the moment, which is that so many of these problems, issues, controversies we deal with have a common root, which is they involve two people meeting and trying to communicate and failing. And that seemed to me a very modern kind of problem. And so I wanted to ask the question, why are we having such difficulty talking to strangers and how can we make it better?
I was actually wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the autobiographical impulses that you had behind writing this book.
So we're a family of outsiders who have been in the position of being strangers in a number of different contexts. My mom is black and my dad is English. And we were immigrants. My mom was an immigrant twice over. She immigrated first to England from Jamaica in the 50s. When we moved to Canada when I was a kid, I was conscious of the fact that I didn't sound like other people, and I didn't dress like them, and I didn't look like them. So I think it's probably impossible to have a childhood where you do feel like an outsider and not think about these issues.
I really enjoyed the beginning of the book, especially with the interaction between your father and a stranger. I was just wondering, were there any interactions with other strangers that have influenced your book in any way?
Yes, so I do open the book with this funny story of my dad staying at this fancy hotel and having this long conversation with someone, my father, who knew nothing about popular culture. I asked him about it afterwards. He said, I met this guy, we talked about gardening, but the whole time people were coming up to him and asking him to sign little pieces of paper. And I realized it was some massive celebrity. And my father never figured out who it was. It didn't occur to him. I spend a lot of the time talking about how useful are people's facial expressions and demeanor in understanding what's going on inside their heart, what their emotions are. The answer is they're not very useful. The case of Amanda Knox, to which I devote a chapter, is a textbook example of this. She was the young American student who goes to Italy. Her roommate gets brutally murdered, and the cops in Italy and the tabloid press think she did it, and she could not be more innocent. And the reason, the sole reason why they think...
facial expressions.
She doesn't behave the way they expect her to behave.
But how do you spot someone who's lying?
Well, I don't think you can. This has been something that psychologists have been studying for years and years and years, and the overwhelming conclusion is that almost all of us are barely better at chance at spotting lies. We get misled by facial expressions. We think we know what lying looks like, and we don't. And also because we're inclined to believe what people say.
Hi, my name is Derek Muller. I make a YouTube channel called Veritasium, which is all about science and the search for truth.
Oh no!
And I'm really passionate about getting to the bottom of things. In your book, you talk about how judges aren't very good at actually picking who should get bail, and that an algorithm would do, say, 25% better. Do you think that we might move to a system one day where there are no judges and instead bail is algorithmically designed?
Yeah, I think it's a bad idea. So you never want to be in a situation where you've dehumanized the criminal justice system.
Well, see, this is the part I find strange, is like in all of these arguments, you know, you say we can show that the machine is better, but you don't want the machine?
I want the machine. What is important to me is that when someone is told whether they are going to go free or be put behind bars, which is one of the most consequential acts that any state does towards one of its citizens. It is the most, I mean, other than take your life, that cannot come from a machine. I am always struck by how often my first impressions about people are wrong. So I have one example is I do a podcast now called Revisionist History. 4 years ago when we started, I hired a producer named Mia. And Mia said, now I realize that these guys might actually be, but it's fine. This is a story open.
They're gonna watch this.
Mia said, I want to bring my friend Julia to be your editor. So I meet Julia, and I think, I don't want Julia to be my editor. And she would say stuff, and I would like, I don't understand like what Julia is doing here. She and I were so different. We don't see eye to eye. Her sensibility is totally different from mine. She's like super crunchy, Brooklyn, radical. I'm like I'm a Canadian. I'm like not. So a year went on where I was like, Julia, I didn't know her very well. The second year, I would start to listen to what she had to say, and I was like, actually, she says really, really, really smart things. The third year, I was like, oh my God, Julia is a genius. So the fourth year, I was like, I can't do it without Julia. Julia, and then we did an audiobook version of this book, which is
It's really good.
it's bananas. Julia did that, right?
What?
She's the genius behind that. So like, my point is, I encountered her as a stranger, and I was 100% wrong. In the case of Sandra Bland, the police officer thinks she's dangerous. She's not dangerous. She's upset. There's a world of difference between those two
That's my
things.
biggest fear, because I'm 20 years old. I don't have my license yet. And the Sandra Bland case was actually one of the reasons. And like for me, my biggest fear, like I'm more afraid of getting pulled over than I am of actually getting into an accident.
It's heartbreaking that we're at a point in our society where young people like you are seriously wondering whether they should get a license out of a fear of interactions with law enforcement. I mean, it is, can we really be at that position in 2019? That's crazy.
I know. Like my dad, he had the talk with me. He's like, if you ever get pulled over, this is what you do, right? And
Wait,
after reading,
what did he say?
he basically said, he's like, you comply. You act like you just won the lottery. You're the happiest person. You love that he pulled you over. And I'm like, what? Well, I'm like, okay, I guess so. And he said, the reason you do this is because as long as you're complying, they're not gonna be suspicious of anything. My name's Naya, I'm 20 years old, and I have a YouTube channel called Naya Reads and Smiles. Today, I'm going to be doing a huge unboxing. I literally have a stack of books up to here. I love books, it's my whole life. Your favorite book?
Of all time?
Yeah, yeah.
How can there be one book?
You could choose a genre.
I have 1,000 books in my library, more than that. How about The Spy Who Came In From the Cold by John le Carre?
Favorite place to read?
I have a little house in upstate New York where I go on the weekends, and I have a little nook, and I read in the nook.
Kind of just like get away from the world. Favorite place to write?
There's a coffee shop in my neighborhood where I spend an inordinate amount of time.
Do they know you? Like they know your order and everything?
They know everything. They're sick of me, in fact.
How do you think police methods can be improved?
The police need to use their authority and their power strategically.
Right.
The same kind of tactics that might make perfect sense in a very, very, very high crime neighborhood make no sense whatsoever in the rest of the city. I remember as a kid in small town Canada being pulled over and by a cop. First of all, I knew him. I'd met him many times. I was friends with his son. He went to our church. He was friends with my parents, and he lived down the street. Like, I grew up in a very small town. But like, there's no way that encounter goes awry. Like, first of all, I know if I do anything wrong, he's gonna call my mom, right? And secondly, I know he's a big, gruff guy,
Right.
but I've known him for years and years and years. And he says to me, Malcolm, first thing, Malcolm, he knows my name, right?
Right.
What are you doing? You were going like 60 miles an hour, you know, and it was fine. Like,
You're not afraid, like he's gonna pull a gun on you.
He's not going to
ever.
pull a gun
Right.
on me. He knows. And so in the case of Sandra Bland, what would have happened had she been familiar to the cop? The whole conversation proceeds differently. He, could have gone awry, but he probably says, "Oh, Sandy, I haven't seen you in years. You realize what you just did." And she would like, "Brian," and she would have had some memory of this guy. Maybe he was like a bit of a jerk, or maybe he was a nice guy, or maybe they went on a date. I mean, I don't know. The point is, they have another way to interact, because the problem they have is that he has all the power. He has a gun. He's standing up. She's sitting down. He's local. She's from out of town. I mean, you can go on with all these ways in which there are barriers to them having a proper communication. And this is the issue with strangers, with being an outsider, as she is in that moment, is you don't have easy ways of relating to someone in a position of authority. And so I spent a lot of time in the book talking about, in the light of something like Sandra Bland, how ought the police behave differently? And I think you have an obligation to rethink law enforcement strategies once you understand that a police officer cannot pull over somebody who he has never met and understand who she is and what her motivations are in 30 seconds. It cannot be done. And the opportunity for error is so large that we have to do something about it.
One of the examples in the book that I really liked was the case study, The Friends Fallacy, because I come from a background in theater where we 100% believe that we could read people through transparency, that we could look at you and we have our gut feelings, and there's lots of talk about your body and how you feel pulled towards other actors and all of these other things, and that you're, going for that kind of communication. But I wondered if you could explain a little bit for people who haven't read the book yet what the Friends Fallacy is and why you chose Friends.
Yeah. So Friends is interesting. If you ask someone who's just seen an episode of Friends to describe what happened, can't do it. So many things happen. It's like unbelievable. You have to like get a flow chart and like with Monica, it goes in this direction and then this happens. And you're going like a million different directions. It's like so complicated. But at the same time, no one has ever watched an episode of Friends and then said, they lost me. Like halfway through. Right? Never happened, right? So why is it that this show with this insanely complicated plot is nonetheless, in fact, so easy to follow that you couldn't turn the sound off and follow it? And the answer is the actors on Friends are emotionally transparent. Every single emotion they feel is perfectly represented on their face. And I proved this because I went in and I got FACS. And FACS is this academic system developed by psychologists that allows you to code someone's facial expressions. So I find this woman, Jennifer, teaches it up in New Hampshire. I send Jennifer a clip of 2 minutes of a Friends episode. And I say, go through the episode and code everyone's facial expressions and let's figure out whether they match the emotion they're feeling. And the answer is they match perfectly every time. When Phoebe is surprised, her eyes go wide, her jaw drops, and her eyebrows shoot up. When Ross is perplexed, as Ross often is, his face looks like someone who's perplexed. When Joey looks dumb, Joey looks dumb. Like, there's no ambiguity. And so I think what happens is that we have an expectation that's, that's the way the world works.
Right.
And that if you look at me and you look unhappy, it means you're unhappy. But in fact, no. Normal human beings don't do that, not even remotely. If I were to shock you right now by doing some outrageous thing, you might think that your face would show shock. There's a very, very good chance that your face would show no shock at all. Your jaw would not drop. Your eyes would not go wide. You would not gasp. Your eyebrows would not shoot up. You might just look at me like you're looking at me now. But you would feel shocked, right? So there are so many cases of people misreading strangers because they invest so much significance in what they're gathering from body language, and it means nothing.
Hi, I'm Danielle Bainbridge, and I'm the host and primary writer of Origin of Everything, which is a PBS Digital Studios original series that talks about underrepresented and undertold history that makes up our collective narrative. I'm so glad to be here discussing your new book, Talking to Strangers, and I'm wondering if you could just read the last line for me.
Absolutely. Because we do not know how to talk to strangers, what do we do when things go awry with strangers? We blame the stranger.
So I'm wondering if you could, last lines, they have so much gravitas, so much importance, and it's so challenging to figure out where to land. And you begin the book with Sandra Bland and you end the book with Sandra Bland. So I wonder, this final line, what does it mean to you in the larger scope of the argument?
That final line is an attempt to capture part of what is tragic and heartbreaking about Sandra Bland's story, which is that she's a young black woman who is pulled over by a police officer for no reason. She is arrested on the flimsiest of pretexts. She's humiliated, and then she commits suicide in her cell in despair. And in the end, they blame her. After all of that, she's dead and buried in the ground. It's a year later, and they're like, yeah, she just didn't like police officers.
And in a lot of your analysis of Sandra Bland and of her case was that the escalation was not necessary, that there was a way that they could have interacted, that they could have talked across the stranger divide without necessarily having these high stakes encounters that end in violence or end in suicide. You mentioned in other books that you've written that when you grew your hair longer, you were also stopped by police officers more frequently. I wonder if you could speak to us a little bit about what those interactions were like.
Yeah, I mean, there was a time when in the kind of 90s, late 90s, when my afro was
It was the
full on.
moment for it.
That was the moment. And I went from having very short hair to having a lot of hair, and noticed instantly that the way in which I was perceived by people in positions of authority was different. Good Lord, I grow my hair out, and all of a sudden, that first impression of someone looking at me is causing them to treat me in a profoundly different way than I was before. I'm getting pulled out of the security line at airports. I remember once these 3 cops pulled me over because they thought I resembled a rapist that had been running around my neighborhood. It's like crazy. When my hair was short, none of that happened. So just literally 3 inches of fro turned me from friend to foe. So it's like, that was a kind of a reminder of just how crucial these impressions are.
It seems like we've gotten to a place where paranoia and hypervigilance is the only emotional interaction we can have when we're encountering someone who's in law enforcement, or that's sort of the default training that they're given, which is approach someone with the suspicion of what the worst thing possible they could be doing is. So they're not part of the community, they're automatically an outsider, they're automatically not one of us. I wonder if there are any lessons that we could learn about the political sphere where we cast someone aside and think of them as not part of the community, not one of us, not someone who should be trusted.
It's a really, really good question. All of us have multiple identities, multiple ways in which we describe ourselves, multiple communities that we belong to, multiple ways we have of representing ourselves in the world. And I think we run into trouble when that list gets too short. So one of the people my age love ragging on people your age. And one of the things that the mistakes people my age make is to get all worked up about, millennial identity politics and things like that. I kind of really love identity politics because to my mind what it is people saying, the ways in which you have categorized me are insufficient. I have other dimensions. You can understand me according to my gender, you can understand me according to my cultural background, according to my interests, according to I could go on and on and on, according to where I'm from, and that is super helpful. What is dangerous is where I look at you and I only see your skin color, or I look at you and I only see the fact that you're not Caucasian. And I think that's the danger we're running in now is we're looking at people and we're only seeing their political affiliation. And, even the most diehard socialist on one hand or Trump supporter on another, that is only one identity of multiple identities. And if you talk to them and listen to them, you might discover that of their 7 available identities, you see eye to eye with them on 5. To take it back to Sandra Bland, all Brian Encinia sees is how she's black, she's from out of state, she's driving a Hyundai, right? Like, what's she doing here? Right? That's his, as opposed to saying, where she's from and her race and her gender are just 3. She has 5 other things that they may be able to see eye to eye on. That's what I would think is the issue.
Were there any other cases in the original version that didn't make it to the final version of this book that you just took out or put more back in?
So I have a bunch of spy stories in the book.
That's
and
my favorite.
I have a huge soft spot for spy stories. And there was a point early in the book where it was like half spy stories. And then I realized, it's quite possible, Malcolm, that the rest of the world is not as enthusiastic for spy stories as you are. So I took a lot of them out. But they were all the same. The thing about spy stories is that they're all about the spy gets away with spying for years. No one, and it's not because they're great spies, it's because everyone else can't see it, right? They don't understand the stranger. And so after like the fourth one, I was like, you know what, I think I've made my point. So I cut myself back. A great, maybe very sad, but I cut it back to two spy stories.
Did you do an extended edition, the bonus spy stories?
In the book, in the endnotes, I think I put in one of my lost spy stories.
My name is Elias from the channel Elias. I'm 24 years old and currently in university, my last year, fingers crossed.
Today, I want to talk about some of my favorite and most anticipated releases of 2019.
When I got the email inviting me, and I was like, this is fake. It was like almost like a dream come true. So, hi, here I am today. I'm 24 years old. It's my last year at the university. I was just wondering if you had any advice for people around my age, coming out of college and going to like the real adult world and getting a job and everything like that.
Anyone coming out of college is about to go into a series of alien settings. Work for companies, organizations where you may know no one.
Yeah, it's scary.
Where you will be judged and where you have to judge others, right? And what I would say, I guess, based on this book is that in all of those novel encounters, reserve judgment. Don't come home after the first week and say, I hate my boss. You don't know whether you hate your boss, right? Yeah. So coming to an understanding of a stranger is something that is at best imperfect and takes time.
You write in the book that you're an optimist.
Am I? Well, I'm a little bit of both.
Didn't you write that in the book?
I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic we can get better, but then we're really bad. Like we are, when we're confronted with people we don't know, epically bad at making sense of them. And once you acknowledge that fact, I think it changes the way you behave. The last part of the book when I'm spending a lot of time with the criminologists and talking about policing strategies, it was only after I think those conversations when I realized, wait a minute, there's a whole school of thinking in the law enforcement world that is obsessed with what can go wrong in a stranger encounter and is trying to fix it and no one's listening to them. That made me realize, okay, this is a book.
After someone reads your book, what do you want them to walk away with? What should they think about talking to strangers?
I want them to learn to second guess themselves. I want them to slow down and to consider the possibility when they encounter a stranger that they may be wrong in how they make sense of that stranger.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you for taking time out of your day to come talk to us for strangers. And found it really fascinating, really enjoyed the book.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
We're the college brochure.
We are the college brochure.